So if we start at the molecular level, you're taking a drug, a chemical, even if it's naturally occurring, it's still a chemical, that looks a lot like what's already in our brains. And generally that's how drugs work. They kind of mimic the natural system. And that's what's happening with psychedelics. They look a lot like a natural chemical called serotonin. And they're kind of serotonin imposters. They come in and they hijack the serotonin system. And they do that in a particular way. The serotonin system is this really complex, we call it a neuromodulatory system in the brain. It modulates function rather than a kind of crude sort of excitation or inhibition. It's more of a kind of tweaking of function. And psychedelics seem to work on a particular aspect of the serotonin system that we think is probably there for adaptability, for our ability to change. And with psychedelics, we know that people can change dramatically, both under the compound in terms of the quality of consciousness, dramatically alters, to the extreme with high doses. And then also afterwards, there can be these really interesting and significant lasting psychological changes as well. So with a big dose of a psychedelic, you're actually getting quite a substantial occupying of a particular aspect of the serotonin system. So there's these serotonin receptors that ordinarily serotonin would bind to, but in this case the psychedelic does, and we can, through certain brain imaging techniques, see what proportion of those receptors are occupied by different doses of psychedelics. And if you give a big dose, the kind of doses that I know Synthesis use in your retreats, in your sessions, and they're quite similar doses to what Imperial use and other research teams use in therapeutic contexts. And those doses occupy about 70% of the available serotonin receptors that we're interested in, and that seems to be an important threshold. And then at that level of occupancy, you see some really interesting changes in the quality of brain activity. Brain activity is a sort of mixture of a sort of a balance of disorder and order. There has to be some regularity there so that our experience of the world can be relatively ordered, but also there has to be a bit of not chaos, but on that spectrum, some flex, and because of that, we can be adaptable and we can adapt to changing circumstances. Otherwise, we'd be too, like statues, too rigid. And so that's what the brain does ordinarily. But what psychedelics do is they push you a little bit more to that chaos end, and so more flexibility, more adaptability during the experience, kind of extreme adaptability. So that's why we're so sensitive to the context that we're in. And that context, it's worth reminding ourselves, because this can be forgotten, is both the external context and the internal one as well. It's what we house in our minds and brains already. And then if we zoom up a level now, we've looked at the molecular with the serotonin receptors, and then up to the brain activity that becomes more chaotic, if you want. We can look at brain systems or networks and how their organization changes. So under a big dose of psychedelics, we've got a few rules that seem to be quite reliable from the brain imaging research that we've done. And these are that the brain networks will break down in integrity. So, a network has different nodes, different bits, and they link up. If that network's really integrous, all the activity's going up and down in synchrony, and there's high integrity within that system. Under psychedelics, that breaks down. All the different bits start to play out in a kind of their activities playing out in a more anarchic way rather than following a kind of marching, rule. They start to play a bit, and so those networks break down. But then if you look at the whole of the brain, you'll see that systems that are ordinarily quite distinct from each other, probably because we need that to have quite finessed, precise, specialized functioning So, when we do vision, we need to know that that's a visual modality and not to get it confused with the auditory modality, hearing, for example. But under psychedelics, that differentiation, that segregation breaks down as well. So zooming out now and looking at the whole of the brain, you could say that global brain integrity, so not networks, but global brain integrity actually goes up because the segregation between systems breaks down. So there's a desegregation in the brain under big doses of psychedelics. And intuitively, it kind of makes sense, and it's a hypothesis that's somewhat backed by evidence. It sort of makes sense that that very profound sense of interconnectedness, of oneness, of a dissolution of you being boundaried off from other people relates to the equivalent in the brain, that brain systems that are ordinarily kind of boundaried off from each other start to blend into each other, and you get this globally integrous brain. So that's a trip itself. It's another story for when people come down, but that's a relatively comprehensive summary of what's happening in the brain under a big dose of psychedelics.